So, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about surveys and analyzing survey data. So, surveys are extremely common. I'm sure everybody hopefully has some familiarity with surveys and either having written them yourselves or created them, having participated in them and given your feedback on something, or potentially if you have used them before trying to analyze the data that results from creating a survey and things like that. So, surveys in program evaluation are very common in a number of different places. And so, we talk a lot about secondary data analysis. We talk a lot about, primary data collection, research design. Interviews and focus groups are things that we have learned about that are useful and they're informative, but they are probably much, much less frequently used than surveys. I would say probably other than secondary data analysis, where information is already being collected in administrative records or files or directly from either patients or participants or things like that. I would say that probably next to that, surveys are your more common probably form of data collection than anything else. So they're very common. They get used a lot. They are, I would say they seem probably more simple than they are. They can be very simple in terms of a few questions and a few basic things. Writing them can be a little more tricky in terms of when you get to more and more advanced stages. So I know we offer at the Claremont Colleges whole semester-long courses that are just dedicated to surveys alone, particularly because there's a lot you can do with surveys. There's also a lot that you have to be careful about because of the fact that you have to be very cautious about how you write questions. The way you write a question can lead people a certain way. You have to be cognizant of like, well, how do I administer a survey to get, high response rates, get a lot of people to answer? How do I check to see if people are paying attention? These days, a lot of people will, I get a survey and I just click something because I want to say that I did it, but I'm just getting it over with. And how do we deal with those type of issues? So there's a lot of nuance that goes into surveys because, these days, it's very important. So, as we see here, they're everywhere, right? You go shopping, you get a receipt, you can call in and give your feedback, right? You get a coupon, you check into a flight, you get a give us your feedback type of a thing. Pretty much everywhere you go, you'll get a phone call, right? Political polls, business uses them, government uses them. Everybody wants to get person feedback, right? And this is why, right? Your opinions and your perceptions. The only place your opinions and your perceptions exist is in your head, right? And the only way for us to ask them or to find out is to ask you, right? Not everything that people say is what they will do. So there is that caveat that obviously we have to be cognizant of what we're asking, because we may get people who say something that's not exactly how they behave, either because they want to seem better than they are, or, in some cases, there's things like focus groups where people talk to teens about drug use or alcohol use. And what you actually get is people reporting that they use drugs or alcohol in front of their peers when they actually don't, because there's a stigma associated with not being the one that does, right? So you might actually find out in either one of these two situations that sometimes people, they do different things than they say they do. And that's mostly because they might either, right, they're trying to look better than they are, or they're trying to say something that's worse, presumably, than they want to let on. Right? We do need data that captures behavior. We also sometimes do need data that captures the opinion about behavior. Right? How do people feel about the death penalty? How do people feel about political issues? And what would you likely vote for if you were given the following options? Those type of things are important. Right? So we need to use surveys for these reasons. Two major challenges. Obviously, one of them is response rates. If any other thing you learn, about response rates, it's this. Just report what yours is, right? Response rate is, right, number of completes, how many people actually finished your survey, right, divided by number of invites. It's easy to calculate. All you want to say is that we had 1,000 people who were asked to participate in our survey, 500 completed it, we have a 50% response rate, right? Regardless, whatever the number is, you want to be transparent about saying what that number is, right? 60%, and this is, a textbook type of answer, which is, well, 60% or higher is a high or good or acceptable response rate. These days it's sometimes hard to tell. People administer surveys where, you might have a customer satisfaction survey up on your website, for example. We do this at the department, which is on our public health homepage. There's a survey. At any time you can give us feedback and you can tell us how we did, complain about something, right? Believe in how we can improve type of information. All of that stuff you can do on there. We don't know what our response rate is, right? Because we don't have a system where everybody who's helped or interacts with us can leave feedback in some way. It could be 1 million people a day. It could be 200 people a day. We're not sending out an invitation and only a set number of people get to get the invitation, right? So we don't always know. Sometimes, right, that's problematic for us, but it's better than not doing it all. When you're doing evaluation work, this is why we talk so much about treatment control group selection, sample size, and sampling approach. You need to know the number of people that you're going to be inviting to participate, because you also need to follow up with them after they have decided to participate. You need to see if they drop out, if you have an attrition threat. Right? If you're going to be doing surveys, you need to be able to calculate your response rate by knowing how many people are asked to participate. All those things are important. Right? That is kind of its own preliminary issue. And a lot of stuff on surveys now deals with, how do you get high response rates? How do you get people to actually participate? Issues of survey fatigue, which is, right, if you ask me 200 questions in your survey, I'm not going to make it all the way through, and you're going to get almost no one who does. I'm going to drop off after 10 questions or 5 questions or 10 minutes in where I get sick of answering your questions. So there's this whole school of thought that's really now looking at, how do we get people to answer our questions? How do we get them to stick with our surveys? How do we design a survey? Simple tips like demographic questions should maybe come at the end of a survey because they're very easy to answer. They're not really cognitively intensive. And so, when you're trying to get people to finish out, that's a good thing to put at the end of a survey, because people, they know who they are in terms of demographics. They can breeze through that pretty quickly, right? Whereas they might stick through that, as opposed to if you put all the hard questions at the end, or the important questions at the end per se, they might drop off before they ever get there, and now you got nothing, not useful information. So having tricks where, if there's anything you need to ask that's important, ask it first, right? Because if they don't make it to question 3, at least you got something usable out of questions 1 and 2. The second kind of field of scholarship and study in surveys is this idea of questions that work, right? Writing questions, as much as it seems like it's probably easy, it's a lot more thought than it seems. Right? They need to be understandable, and that means, right, they might need to be translated to a different language. You might need somebody who, if you have, let's say, 2,000 participants from across the country with different education levels, different cultural backgrounds, different religions, different linguistic characteristics, you need all of those people to read the same question in the same way and think of the same thing. Right, which can sometimes be difficult because we use different words in different contexts and different meanings, right? And you can say, well, if you say, tell me what you think about the president and how, good or bad of a job they're doing, right? Well, that could trigger a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Do you mean about the economy? Do you mean about defense? Do you mean about foreign policy, etc.? Right? And right, this unbiased question, which is, if I were to say, tell me how good of a job you think the president's doing, I've sort of at least somewhat implied that he's not doing a bad job because I said good, right? And if I make a scale that is, very good, good, or somewhat good, right? You have no option to say he's not doing a good job. And now what I've done is I've biased your response, because the only 3 things you can choose from are some variation of good job, right? And that may not be what my actual opinion is, right? So I always think of, if you ever used to watch the Colbert Report, when he was, back when he would interview people, he'd always talk about President George Bush, and he'd say, question to you as a guest of my show, George W. Bush, great president or greatest president? Right? That's a good example of what would be a biased survey question. You don't want to choose either of those 2 answers because maybe you don't like that president particularly, right? But those are your only 2 choices, right? So even if I respond, I'm kind of trapped into giving you information that's not really what I think, right? So that's kind of one of those scenarios. Again, right, this is important, which is, no matter what you do, right, include a copy of your survey questions, right? Transparency is key. If I, as a reader, am going to later decide whether I want to use your work, trust your results, etc., the best thing you can do for me is put all of your survey questions in the end of the study so I can look at them for myself and make my own informed opinion. Right? I might think your questions are biased and no longer put any faith in your research. A lot of times, I do this a lot, which is someone will ask me to come up with a survey for something that is nothing I've ever worked on before. Right? Well, what do? I have to go find online different people who've done research like it before, find their appendices, look at the survey questions they've asked, and adapt and tweak and work with those because, right, it's better than starting from scratch because I have somewhere to go with it, right? Especially, like I got asked to make that customer satisfaction survey. Right? That's pretty easy to do, right? Not because I do it all the time for a living, but because everybody in the private sector and the business world has customer satisfaction surveys. There's a lot of templates. I just get to pick and choose which ones I like or narrow down a list, talk to my team and pick, the few that we really think are applicable to us. So no matter what, right, this gives you that option to go back and say, I saw the questions, I like those, I want to use them, I trust them, or they're all garbage. Right, this is a complete waste of time. Let me move on to the next piece of research that I actually might have some faith in. Right, limitations. Right, when seeking very specific data from records or files, right, things you need to know. If you're looking to, right, the idea here is if something was too long ago in the past, right, sometimes it's better to look up files and get secondary data because people might not remember. Right? If you want to ask somebody, on such and such date 9 years ago, right? We have records that indicate that you were stopped for a traffic violation. Right? Do you remember this incident and tell me about what you were stopped for? Right? If you get pulled over a lot or it was that long ago and you're a heavy drinker or something, right, you may not remember any of that incident whatsoever. Right? So if you ask people, if you say, have you ever been pulled over in the last 10 years or stopped, right, for a traffic violation? You might say no. When in actuality, we have, a citation record on file from the police, right? Well, asking the survey question was probably not the best data collection strategy because it was maybe minor and you don't remember, when in actuality in the police record, we have proof of the citation. So we know that it happened. We have some information on it, right? In those instances, right, it's hard to remember, or if it might be hard to remember, or it might be hard to remember accurately at least, that is when sometimes that records or files for secondary data becomes a more useful approach, right? This is also probably really important. If you are dealing with surveys and you're dealing with response rates and people who don't want to complete your survey, don't want to stick with a lot of questions, people probably aren't going to also go even one step further and dig up a lot of old records to get you accurate information about what you're asking about. They're either going to just guess off the top of their head, which means you get bad information, or they're going to either skip your questions or stop participating in your survey because you asked them some question about how many miles on their vehicle, like how many miles did your vehicle have the last time you brought it in for scheduled service, or repair, and people are like, well, I don't have any of the records. I'd have to call the dealership, right? And what seemed like maybe just a general question like an auto company might want to ask to find out some information from you, you're not going to answer or take your time to bother with because I don't remember, I don't have that record, I'm not going to call. This is more work, right? So a lot of things that you want to do with survey questions should be questions that somebody right now or very recently can generally know pretty certainly off the top of their head. Right? They are likely going to take their best guess or just not complete the survey if you do these, right? If you believe that data is required from records, it's best to, as the researcher, go gather it yourself, work with the entity that has it, right? This is obviously important in terms of, right, research ethics and compliance reasons, which is you'll still need approval to get access to that data and those files, right? That might be a lot of work. But if you want to make sure you have the accurate information, the right information, that's the better approach to take because people will not remember otherwise, and the data that you get is flawed, right? A little bit of more logistical burden is worth it for better and actually useful data, as opposed to the alternative, which is let people guess or let people, just skip on your survey because they're not going to answer anyway, and then you have no usable data or wrong data. Different types of surveys. Right, administered versus self-administered. right? This is kind of the same way of saying like self-paced, right? Most of what we get these days is a self-paced. You get a link, you open it up, there's a survey, you fill it out online, right? And that's how it goes. Administered, these are a lot more common when you have either phone surveys, when literacy might be an issue, right? Sometimes, if you're dealing with children or people who haven't learned to read yet, things like that. Sometimes language translation. So think about the interview protocol and how a person will sit down and ask all the questions and guide the participant through. The same is true of an administered survey, right? You might get a phone call from a polling organization, walks you through each question, reads you all the options, you respond, they move you to the next question. Now, you're not doing it yourself and filling out the piece of paper. They're talking you through and just getting your response, right? If they can't read, right, sometimes it's useful to do a administered survey because, if you're dealing with homeless populations or people who are uneducated and they may not necessarily be able to read, right? Sometimes it's useful to be able to administer it yourself, speak to them, get their answer. Right? You're still using a survey. It's still very structured. You're still recording the response for them, right? But unlike an interview where you're asking an open-ended question, right? You're asking questions that they get to directly respond to, and you're just verbatim annotating what they say. Right? Language. Sometimes if you have a translator, sometimes it's easier to have a person who can't read English, have somebody in Spanish translate to them, right? Get their answers for you in an administered fashion. Things like that. So mail, obviously. Paper flyers, they could be mailed out. The survey gets sent to you via on a piece of paper in the mail. Right, that's probably a little less common these days, mostly just because of the cost and logistical reasons of sending everything out. Things like this. Right, self-paid postage. If you're ever going to do a mail survey, you need to probably have an envelope that has postage paid so that if they want to send it back to you, you cover that cost. Because the difference between the people who say, please fill out my survey and also use a stamp to mail it back to me versus those who've already covered it, you're going to see a huge difference in response rates. Right? It's pretty well tested from people before that you get much higher response rates when I've paid for the postage and all you have to do is drop it back off, as opposed to going on your way to pay for the stamp, especially if you're dealing with either low-income populations, people who don't use mail very frequently, things like that. Right? There's different reasons one might be better, right? If you're dealing with possibly a more senior population where they don't necessarily have web or aren't very phone friendly, mail might be your better option. So things like that are going to be more useful, right? Telephone survey, obviously, we call you up. Somebody on the other end of the line has the survey, walks you through, asks you all the questions, gets your feedback, records the response for you. And then what we're mostly all used to these days is the email or web-based. Right? I sent you a link. You click the link, open the web page, and participate in the survey, things like that. With some general guidelines, there are a number. There's two different. They're called Qualtrics. There's two different cheat sheets that I've posted as in the reading section for you here. I would definitely recommend you use those, and even to this day, I still keep those readily available for myself when I'm writing questions. Right? If you're not going to take an entire semester-long class on how to write surveys or read a whole book on it, they're two very, very good guidelines to follow. They basically have like 7 bullets on each. They're about 2 to 3 pages, easy read, and they basically tell you, a rule of thumb. There's one for questions, and then there's one for surveys. So 7 tips about how to write good survey questions. They give you a tip or a rule to follow. They give you an example, typically of a bad question that shows you what happens, what it looks like when you don't follow that rule. And that's the survey question, or the question one. The other version talks about surveys in general, right? So how do you design a survey, and gives you tips for, right, don't make it too long, put the important questions up front, things like that. So both of those are very good guides. This is a number of kind of bullet points that have to do with those. Right? Clear, very simple language. You want to try to not jargon or complicate things too badly so people understand what you're saying. right? Obviously, you watch the length of the survey, make sure that it's short. Typically, right now, about best guidance is between 5 and 15 minutes at most. Anything that's probably a 10 to 20 minute survey likely is something you need to be paying someone for participation in, or having a very good incentive structure for why they need to stick with it. So, sometimes in government programs, nonprofit programs, you can require participation in the evaluation as a condition of receiving benefits with consent. And so sometimes things like that, where they're coming into the office for their appointment, you get the survey right when they're there, things like that. Any less than that, it's going to be more difficult if it becomes longer and longer. So you'll see, I think Expedia is a good one, that anytime like I book a hotel for work and then I check in, right, I get one email that basically says like, how was your check-in experience? And it's a smiley face or a frowny face. And it's one question. I click it and it says, thank you. And we're done. Right. Like, that's the type of survey that people are moving to, because like, yeah, I'm probably willing to, when I get my email, open it up, click the button, and then delete it if it's one extra kind of swipe or touch, as opposed to if you gave me a 20 question survey that took me 15 minutes every time I checked in, like I'm not going to do that. Right. So maybe, some people will do, it's very common is you'll see something like this, where you've got happy face person, you've got average face person, right? And underlying this is, like a 3-2-1 scale. Something as simple as that, right? You get a number, you get a rating, right? You get information that's usable, and you have a survey that a lot of people might complete because it's not that long, it's not that hard. All I got to do is press 1 and be on my way. All right, provide a range of responses. Generally, the idea here is, and the Qualtrics documents give you that too, which is, right, you generally don't want to do this if you can help it, right? If your options are yes or no, right, it's probably too simplified, because you basically are going to only have, you're not going to get a variation in the range of responses, right? And these tend to be pretty extreme. So anything, even this, where you have 3 options, right? Or you'll see ones where you have, right, strongly agree, right, neutral, disagree, right, strongly disagree. Right, you got a 5 choice option. Even that's better, right? So rather than saying like, do you eat vegetables on a regular basis? Yes or no. Right? You can say in the last 7 days, do you eat, would you say that you eat on average at least 1 cup of fruits or vegetables a day? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, right? Because maybe I don't eat every day, but I'm definitely not a no. Right. And your other question, I might say, well, no, I don't, because I don't 1 cup a day. Like if I don't meet that criteria, then I'm a no, as opposed to being able to say, well, I'm kind of neutral, or I kind of agree. I don't eat it every day, but I do at least most of the time, which makes me not an absolute no. Right. Only 1 question at a time. You don't want to ask what they call a double barrel question. Right. This is another thing in the Qualtrics guide. Right. If I were to ask a question of my staff and say, well, we're going through the budget process for next year, I want to know on a survey question, do you have an interest in requesting additional money from, from the director for our budget, and would you like it to be cut from money from elsewhere to recoup costs that we need for other things, right? It's 2 questions, and I might be trying to say, yes, I do want us to request more money because I feel like we need it, right? But I'm not saying yes to, I want you to cut it from other parts in our budget to make it up if we can't get it from them, right? You want to ask that as 2 different questions, because yes, I'd like you to request more money. If we don't get approval for that money, no, I don't want you to cut anything from anywhere. I'd rather just stay where we're at, right? If I ask it as 1 question, I might get a yes answer that means yes to the first or yes to the second or yes to both, but I don't know which, right? So you need to always be very cautious to ask 1 question at a time, and making sure that way you know what that means. Focus on current experiences, right? If I asked you yesterday or since this morning, how many fruits or vegetables have you eaten as part, 1 cup, 2 cup, 3 cup, 4 cups or more, right? You might remember that. If I asked you yesterday, how many, you might say, yeah, I remember. If I asked you 3 days ago, right, some of you might know and some of you might not. I can't honestly remember even what I ate for dinner 3 days ago. Right? If I asked you 14 days ago, how many cups of fruits and vegetables have you eaten? Right? You're not going to remember. And that's the issue here, is that you got to worry about, right, there's a certain point in time at which like things are big enough life events that people remember, right? How many children have you had, right? I know that I didn't have my baby in the last week, right? But I do remember how many children I've had ever, because it's not a thing I'm going to forget, right? Versus, on average, how many times a day do you feel, drowsy, right? If I'm trying to assess somebody for sleep apnea, right? And I want to find out how many times you feel tired during the day. I want to ask you about 3 weeks ago, because you probably don't remember. I might say in the last 24 hours, today, in the last 7 days, maybe. But anything longer than that is probably a big experience where you're not going to remember. Right. Allow people to skip questions. If you're one of those persons, you can design surveys in a way where you have to require every question. Every time you do that, when someone gets a question they don't want to answer, they're probably going to have to either, they're going to stop, they're going to want to skip it. And if they can't skip it, they're probably going to give up on your survey. If they have the option to move past it, right, they may at least answer all the rest of yours. And so that's a thing that, you want to do if available, right? Leave exits. What this means is, right, you might have strongly agree, right? Neither agree nor disagree, right? Agree and strongly agree, for example, right? And you can choose any of these, right? You always want to have another option, which is I don't know, or I have no opinion, right? That's an exit. Right? If you ask me about, would you say that the library at Cal State Long Beach meets your needs, right? If I say I'm neutral, right, that means it doesn't really meet my needs, right? But it's not so upsetting that it doesn't. But I've been there and I'm kind of in the middle with regard to, like, it's not perfect, right? But it's still pretty good, right? That's a very different answer than I've never been to the library before in my life. I commute to campus. I only take night classes. I have no idea. I've never even stepped foot in the thing. I don't want to give you an opinion, right? If you don't offer this answer, right, people will typically choose this, right? And now they've given you information that is different than what you probably wanted them to tell you, right? Because they are not neutral, right? They haven't been and are not on either of the side of the scale. They just picked the closest answer, right, to what they think, right? They don't actually think. They pick the closest answer to what they feel fits their opinion, right? In some cases, they might not do this. In some cases, they might do this, right? And now you're starting to get answers where, yeah, you know what, I guess it's something I agree with because I've never been before, but it must be fine. So that can be a problem. That's why you want to leave the exit. In terms of one of the questions, what do we need to include in the evaluation assignment in regards to consent? Do we need to include a consent form, or can we just refer to it in the assignment? Generally, as long as you say, like when you talk about data collection, that you would include, a comprehensive consent page that gets people to consent to participation beforehand, that's fine with me. I don't need anything more than that as long as you're aware of it. The only time I would say that that's a little more not the case is if you're dealing with children, mentally ill, possibly prisoners and things like that. Don't just say for consent, but say that like they are a population that we need to be a little more cautious with, right? Or AIDS patients or something like that. Be aware of like the ethical implications. I don't need, a whole 2-page HIPAA compliance statement kind of a thing, but just acknowledge that there's a little more to it than, a consenting 18-year-old normal adult. Right, pre-test. This is very important. Anytime you make a survey, right, you've created one before you deploy it for real. Right, go find people who are like the people who are going to be taking your survey and ask them to participate in it. And don't, you can sit, let them take it in silence and ask them questions afterwards, or walk them through every question and do an administered version of it and say, what do you think this question is asking you? Right, see what they have to say. Do you understand this question? What do you think this is asking? Right, get that feedback and see, because you might find out that they either interpreted it differently than you wrote it. You may find out that they don't understand it at all because you use technical jargon, right, and made it more complicated than a normal person's, an average reader of your survey is going to be able to understand. those type of things you have to take into account and be aware of, right? So we obviously, how the question is written matters. You want to get an opportunity to assess the questions you've written, make sure people understand them, find out what people feel about it, that type of a thing, right? And this is just another good, right, research step. Right? Confidentiality, right? There's a difference between confidentiality and anonymity. Confidential means I have your name, I have your information, but I'm not going to disclose it. I'm not going to report it. We're going to keep that data after it's collected separate from the rest of the results so that no one else would know who it is that answered it. Anonymity is, right, I don't even need to ask you your name, right? I don't care to know because it's not relevant to me. I just need the following information from you, and you can provide me that information. I'm not going to ask you your demographics, or I'm not going to ask you your name or your contact information because I don't care, right? We do that with ours, right? Our customer satisfaction surveys is an anonymous thing. You know, if you want someone to follow up with you because you have a complaint, you can say, I would like someone to follow up with me and give us your information. But if you don't say yes to that question, we don't ask you for your name. We don't care. All we want to know is your feedback because we want to take action on whatever it is that you have feedback about that we can improve. Right? Open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions. These tend to be pretty obvious, right? This is a closed-ended question, right? You will see that you have a fixed set of question responses that you can choose from. Right? You don't get to put whatever you want. It's closed. You have to pick, right, one of these options. Choose a box, you know, slider, multiple check boxes, right? But you don't get to just say whatever you want, right? This is an open-ended question, which is very much like an interview question on a survey, which is, you know, if there's anything that we can do to improve our services, what would it be? Big block of text, and you can write whatever you want to in here, right? You need to fix this, you need to fix that. This lady who works at your front counter is super mean and I don't like talking to her, right? They can put whatever they want in there. It's a qualitative question. You get qualitative data back as opposed to these, right? This is, right, qualitative information versus this is more quantitative, right? We can turn these into numbers and say 1, 2, 3, right, 4, 5, and not applicable, right? And we can put quantitative measures. We can use the statistics, those type of thing. Right, response rate, we obviously talked about this a little, right? It's very hard to get a high one, right? You want a high response rate, or you want the highest response rate that you can really attain more than anything, right? How to do that, right? Incentives is another one, right? If there's even so much as a free chance to win a $5 Amazon gift card, I may potentially participate, as opposed to if it's just, you know, out of the goodness of my heart, you might not get me to do it, right? These other things like what the purpose of the research, the importance, right? Those matter to people, right? I, especially as, you know, an academic who does research, I understand the value of research and what people want it for. So when someone asks me to participate in a survey, I take it very seriously because I understand the importance, right? $5 raffle, you know, an opportunity to get my name in a drawing for a $5 Starbucks gift card doesn't do much for me in terms of me wanting to participate, but knowing, right, what you're going to use the survey for and why you care to get my opinion is enough, right? And if you don't do one of these two things, you just send me a survey, right? I may not care. I don't know what you're going to use it for. You didn't tell me why it's important. I might not do it. You know, especially for like we as a government, when we're sending out things for citizens to complete, we say, you know, we are taking action to spend money on new services. We're considering, you know, 4 different programs and we can only do one. We'd like to know what you think is the thing that we should spend our money on. That means a lot to people because they'll say, oh, wow, I can actually shape like the type of services, right? And this one to me seems really important and I want to have an input on that. So that goes a long way. Right. No matter what, report your response rate. Incentives help. Right. They're not always a guarantee, but they are better. Sometimes, you know, so even simple stuff like maybe it's not maybe it's not a raffle. Sometimes people will do things like, you know, they'll give away $100 Amazon gift card. Right. You have to complete it and get your name drawn. A lot of people feel like I'm not going to probably win that, as opposed to saying, well, the first 20 people to complete the survey will get a $5 Amazon gift card, right? Nobody knows how many have been completed, but they know if they do it, right, I have a chance at it. What you'll see is when you do it that way, right, a lot of people will complete your survey very quickly, right? Because they want to be one of the first people to take a chance at getting it because they know somebody's going to get something, right? So different types of incentives also make differences in terms of the reaction that you get, right? 60%, textbook answer, it's good. Hope for the best, try to rate the high one, do what you can to keep response rates up. I would say personally 60% is great, probably. I think 60% of eligible American voters don't even vote. So if you think 60% on a survey is the low bar for goodness, it's probably not. It's probably less than that, but that's the textbook's answer. Why do we care, right? The reason really, if anything, we care about is, we've talked about threats to internal validity. Anytime, right, let's say you invite 10,000 people, let's say 1,000 people to participate in a survey, and you only get, a 1% response rate where, let's say 10% response rate, you get 100 people out of 1,000. What you don't know, right, much like selection bias, is what about those 100 people is the reason that they completed it, not the other 900, right? A good reason, for example, is the 100 people who had the worst experience with your program and hate it the most are the ones that decided to respond because they wanted to tell you how much you hate it. Now you have a 10% response rate. You look through all of your data, and 100 people who took the time to provide feedback, right, make our program look terrible because nobody had anything nice to say. Right? It may not be that your program's terrible. It may be that 90% of people had nice things to say, but because they only had nice things to say, they didn't waste their time doing your survey. But the 10% that are super passionate and hate your guts, right, they're the ones that did, and they're the ones that now are the only people you have data from. Right? So that's why you want to try to get a higher level, right? Mail surveys, we said, provide the self-addressed stamped envelope. Right? Follow-up reminders. A lot of tools like survey tools now, especially if you load a contact roster of your 1,000 people, survey tools will tell you which of those names have completed. And so you can automate a reminder after 3 days and after 5 days and after 7 days so that the people who haven't completed it yet can be told over and over and over again to complete it. That's another good way of trying to get, right, targeting those people who didn't complete it to try to get them to push to complete it. Right? If it's low, if you have only 10%, you have 100 people out of 1,000, right? Look at the demographics of the people who responded. Maybe they all said terrible things about you, but they also all happen to be, 18 to 22-year-olds out of your whole population. Or maybe they're only just the white respondents who had something bad to say or something like that. Right? So see if they reflect the characteristics. This is kind of the same as the convenience, judgmental sampling approach, which is, it's not necessarily random just because you made sure that the demographic, like you intentionally chose X% of women and X% of men and X% African American, X% Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, and X% Hispanic or Caucasian. Right? Doesn't mean that it's representative, but it does mean at least you have some of the diversity in the cross section that you chose. Same type of thing, right? If you don't know because you have a low response rate, look and see and find out, like, maybe it's not representative of the full 1,000 people, but how off is it? Because maybe you can find out that it is a very specific small group of people that are the ones that responded who are different, right? Maybe they were the ones who had the lowest scores, or they spent the least amount of time in the program, or something that you can hold on to that gives you a reason to see why they might be different than everybody else. Right? This is a good strategy. If you have, let's say, 100 out of 1,000, maybe you try to figure out, let's say you spend, a lot of people will take a new incentive, right? And they'll go after the other 9,000 people and say, well, the 900 people, we didn't get your feedback. We really would like to get some information from you, right? The first 25 people will now get a $20 Starbucks gift card, right? It might cost a little more, but what you can do is you'll get maybe a flood of new people to complete, right? And you'll be able to compare, let's say, even if you only get 28 people, you can compare their responses to these other first 100 and see, right, do they reflect the same thing that everybody else said, right, or do they look different? And if they look different, right, then maybe these people do have a selection bias problem where they're very different in terms of, right, who they are from everybody else. Right. This is the nuance of how you report. You always want to basically, kind of tailor your responses to say, right, of those people who responded, 55% said they would strongly recommend this program, right? This gives you at least some out, right? Don't make bold assumptions and say, everybody in the program thought that the program should be recommended. Like, that's not true. What is true is that of the 100 persons that completed our survey, 55% of them reported that the program provided some value to them, right? At least at that point, right, you're bringing awareness to the idea that it's not a perfect sample, right? There are some issues here, right? But of the people who we got feedback from, this is what they said. Right? When you write these questions, again, the Qualtrics guide is really good for this. Make sure options are mutually exclusive, right? Meaning, I shouldn't, if I have 3 options, so like age, for example, if you were to say, what's your age? 0 to 18, right? 18 to, say, 29, 29 to 50, right? These are not mutually exclusive. If I happen to be 29-year-old, do I check this box or do I check this box, right? You don't know because they're not mutually exclusive, right? This should be 19, right? And this should be 30, right? That way, if I'm 30, I'm in this box. If I'm 29, I'm in the other, right? There's no questions about which one of the responses I fall into, right? Intensity scales over yes, no questions. We talked about that before, right? This idea of softening the ends, right? Instead of saying, right, never, right? You don't want to do that. You want to give people the option of saying, right, almost never. Why that is generally it's kind of a psychological thing. People are more hesitant to say never or always to something because they just don't kind of want to box themselves into feeling like they said, I'll never ever not deviate from that. They're very inclined to much more say almost never or almost always, right? Would you ever go skydiving? Never. Well, wouldn't say never. I'm almost never. I don't really want to. I'm not open to it, but I guess maybe in some scenario I could be talked into it when I'm older, right? I don't know how my preferences are going to change, right? They probably are never going to go still, right? But you want to give them the option to say, right, I don't want to be so concrete, but odds are I'm probably not going to, right? But the fact that if you box me into never, I don't want to take that rigid of a stance because I might change my mind. 2-way versus 1-way, right? You'll see this, right? This is kind of a 1-way question where, right, this is kind of 0, right? And this is more, right? And this is basically a kind of a one-directional thing, which is, it basically moves always this way, versus a 2-way scale, right? Which would be kind of like the strongly, right, disagree to strongly agree scale, which is kind of 2-directional, right? Which is this way is a different response than the other direction, which means it's a 2-way because it could go either this way or that way. And there's different implications of one direction or the other. Right, Likert scale, everybody's probably seen this before. Right, this is the example I've been using for most things. Strongly agree, neither disagree. Right, that's a Likert scale. Right, the exit, right, is this idea here where I don't know, I don't have an opinion. That's right, recommended to always have them. The skip questions, right, did you use the library in the last year? Right, if I say no, I never have. Right, please skip to question 14 because questions 10 through 13 are about the library, and I don't want you to answer them if you've never been before. Most of this, right, is what we call display logic, or sometimes it's called skip logic. Most computer-based survey questions nowadays will let you, if you answer no to this, then move somebody down, right? So that way they don't even see the other questions. They just answer, right, the questions that they actually, have an answer to, and then it automatically moves them on. So that way it doesn't end up looking as big of a survey. Analyzing survey data, right? Look at the number of exits. This is important, right? So if you get all the data back, see how many people said, I don't know, I don't have a no opinion, right? That sometimes in and of itself might mean that there's something worth looking at, right? If I ask a question about the library services and I ask it to 5,000 students across Cal State Long Beach, 90% of them choose no opinion, no answer, right? I don't focus in on the 10% and say, well, what did they have to say about the library? I probably want to know why 90% of 5,000 students have no opinion about the library. Is it because that few people are actually using it? Is it because that few people have, strong opinions about the library whatsoever? There may be something there, and I didn't ask a question about library usage, and so maybe that's why I'm getting a lot of people who have, no opinion. Decision criterion, sometimes, you need to be able to say if there's a Likert scale and there's 5 choices, right? Do any one of them have 50% or more of the people in that choice? Or is there, what you'll see is a lot of times people will combine these two, and then people will combine these two, right? And they either need to be 50% here, or they need to be 50% here, right? Or they'll report basically this group, right? This group, and then this group, what the differences between the agrees, the not agrees, and the neutrals are, right? You want to try to have a decision criteria if you can, right? It sometimes makes it easy for summary reporting because you can say, a majority of people agree with the following statement, right? A majority of people disagree with the following 2 statements, right? So that can be very useful so that you don't have to every time say, well, 22% said they agree, and 15% said they strongly agree, but 9% said they're neutral, and 3%. Right? You don't want to have to get in that habit if you can avoid it. You want to try to call attention to, even if it's not 50%, maybe it's 40% or more, or a plurality. So a majority, a plurality of people, 37% agree with the following statement. Right? Maybe that's what you want to call attention to, so you don't have to spell out the minutia. In a perfect world, right, somebody who's well equipped to read and interpret data themselves could look at the summary chart and know what it means without you needing to spell it out. That's probably, in my experience, not always the case. So you're probably going to need to write up the interpretation for somebody, and any way that you can save time on that and make it easier for somebody, the better. Right. Here's an example of faculty performance. This is a way of, right, if somebody's comfortable with information, in general, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with various aspects of faculty performance, right? So we asked, right, 4 different questions about faculty performance. We gave people a 5-point scale, right? Maybe we did include an exit, but they're not reflected here, right? So you can see what % of people responded very satisfied to their knowledge, generally satisfied to their knowledge, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, etc. Right? What you'll see is, right, we have 94% of people here, right? We have, what is this, 80, right? We have 88% are generally, right? So we can generally say that 94% of people are satisfied with level of faculty knowledge, 88% are satisfied with their ability to relate concepts to the real world setting, right? When we get down here, we start to see a bit more of a cross-section where, right, it's still a majority is in this section here, right, but it is more split. So, right, willingness to meet student needs and availability outside of class, things get a little bit worse, and therefore we need to, we may not report the same way. We may say that it's not a majority, but, right, 24% say that they're not willing to meet student needs, right, and that 26%, right, are not available outside of class. So, right, even though we have a good chunk here, this may be an important thing because we want to draw attention to the fact that, well, of the surveys, right, we know they're knowledgeable, right, they can relate the concepts, but they seem to be a little worse about being available outside of class, and that's something that we want to try to tackle, right? A good tip that I usually will deal with when I work with constituents and clients in the department is, if you're asking a question, what is it that you hope to take action on from the information that you're collecting as a result of that question, right? We have a website satisfaction survey, which is meant to help us improve the department webpage, right? And generally, I've got it down to 3 questions, right? And the first question is, what did you come to our website hoping to find? Right? It's an open-ended question because mostly what I care about is, like, what do you use our website to look for? Because if you say something, and I know that's not something that's on our website, right, I want to put that thing on our website. The other question is, the second open-ended question, that's the number 2, is if, I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but more or less, right? If there's anything we can do to improve our website, what suggestion would it be, right? Because whatever you say is something we want to look at because, it's hard to navigate. There's too many pages. I can't find anything, right? I would, I'd make a search engine so that I can look for what I want, right, quickly. Any of those are things that we can take action on and actually do to change or update, our webpage to the point that we stop getting feedback about those things, because eventually we want people to be like, nothing, your website's great. Right? But we right now, if you say that your website's a 2.0 out of 7 out of 10 on a usability scale, I know that's bad, but I don't know how to do anything with it, right? So even like this question, that might be a little generic to the point that it's hard to know what that means, versus if we had 80% in this category, we'd say y'all need to maybe have some better office hours or more available office hours, or do something, because that's unacceptable. Right? We want to know if we're doing enough current office hours outside of class time, and we're not, because people are discontent with our availability. Right? We talked about this already. Right? Consider the neutral categories as well. The same way that you analyze your exits, you should analyze that middle column and see if the neither agree nor disagrees. Right? Does that mean anything in and of itself? Right? Because it's a different response. Right? It doesn't mean It doesn't mean I have no opinion. It means that I don't agree and I don't disagree. Right? But I'm somewhat in the middle, and I could go either way on this. Right? So that might mean something too. A lot of times, what that means is like you're not horrible, but you're also not fantastic. Right? And so I, at any moment, could either love you or hate you. Right? Think about if you're trying to sell a product. Right? If I'm trying to sell you the new iPhone, and here's my new iPhone, agree means that you love it, and disagree means that you hate it. And the people in the middle are the ones that I'm concerned with the opinions of the most, because if I make some changes, you might move from neutral to loving it, or I could do something that makes you go from neutral to hating it. And that's really important for me, because you're those swing voters, so to speak. Right now, I don't know if I like Trump. I don't know if I like the Democrats, but either one kind of pisses me off a little too much. I might go either direction real quick as a result. Right? That's important too. That's why you want to look at those neutral people. Cross tabulation. So if you've seen these before, right, they can give a little bit more information than just a single percentage. Right? You have your first variable here. Right? You've got your second variable here, and then you actually break down your responses. And typically, what you'll see is also sometimes a total category and a total category, because this should typically be like 100. Well, this might be if you have 57% men and you have 43% women, and you might have what's this 52% white. You might also add these extra columns or rows and cells in there. But the idea is now I can see not just how many were men, right, and how many were white, but I can see both, right? And if I want to see white women, and I want to, right, you get a little bit more nuance and information from it, right? Chi-squared, which looks kind of like this, right? It's a statistical test. You can use it with these. I'll give you kind of an idea of how this works, which is if you have, right, let's say 100 people, right, a sample size of 100, right? You have males and females, and you have, yes, I support the death penalty, and no, I don't support the death penalty, right? If there's no relationship between the four, if your gender has no impact on whether or not you support the death penalty or not, right? I would expect 25% equally split amongst all of these, right? Because if, right, your sex doesn't matter to your opinion, everybody would be evenly split, right? If, right, there starts to be a minor relationship, what we would see would be, let's say, right, 30 and 30 and 20, right, and 20, right? As we start to move this direction, right, we start to see that males a little more favor the death penalty than women, right? If we had a perfect relationship, right, between these two, we would see, right, 50%, 0%, 0%, 50, right? The general idea here is that I can pretty much tell you your opinion on the death penalty depending on what your gender is or your sex is, right? So in this scenario, it's a little more fluid, and over here, it doesn't matter whatsoever, right? So this would be like, right, no relationship, right, weak or maybe moderate relationship, right? And this would be, right, very strong relationship. Chi-squared, right, which is a number, right, is 0 here, right? And as you move this direction, it gets closer to infinity. So the idea basically is that as you have more and more of a perfect relationship and move closer to this, right, fundamental and absolute sort of perfect relationship, right, the number gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So when you run the statistical test, depending on the size, and you don't just read the number, there's a test that will then say, is this chi-squared value likely caused by chance alone, or is it, is it too unlikely to be just from chance, right? And that's what you're testing. So you'll get a number, right, that will fall on this scale, and then you can do a statistical test for that number, right? And you don't really need to know how that math works because the computers these days, SPSS or whatever, will do it for you, right? But that's how you can learn, right, how that type of test is working. Right. Analysis of survey data. Another very common option is to look at analysis of means, right? This is another way of saying averages, right? So if you have a Likert scale, right, where you have strongly disagree, right, neutral, agree, strongly agree, right, and your exit, right, this would be a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-point scale. Right, you can take this and you're going to get an average number that falls somewhere between 0 and 5, right? And you'll basically be able to say, right, well, this is the average response, right? Or this is the average response, right? This, if your average response is 2 out of 5, that tells you that the average person disagrees with whatever that statement is. If you have a 4, right, it means that the average person agrees with that statement, right? So if we were to, use this scale here, right, before, right, this, we ask a question, the city is doing a good job at meeting citizen needs, right? 3.5 last year means that they're a little better than neutral. 4.2 this year, right, means that they're much more likely to be agreeing and near strongly agreeing, right? That means a lot just to compare those two averages, because what it means is, right, we're moving in the direction we want, right? We might not be at a 5, right, but we did jump from here to here in the course of a year as an average, right? And that means that some people, right, are scattered along this line, and some still didn't think you did a good job, and some thought you did a great job, right? But you need to know what your averages are to see where you moved, right? GPAs, grade point averages, we're used to those, right? You want a 4, you don't want a 2. 3 is decent, better than 3 is more ideal. Any questions about that in terms of, right, survey data, anything like that? I'm going to show a few, I'll call them, more real world examples so that you can see something a little more, real life-ish. So what you can see here is, I'll pull a little bit, pull some information up here. So I also want to, for next week too, just to make sure everybody is on the same page with the questions. You're going to have Beachboard questions again. So this is going to be your question, right? So you're going to develop 2 survey questions for your Beachboard posts. One closed-ended and one open-ended. So you have to have one that's going to have the fixed, right, choices, and then you're going to have one that's open-ended. So I have, right, 2 different examples here. You don't have to have 2 of each. You just need to have one open-ended, one closed-ended, but I gave a couple examples so that you can have something to, refer to. For this open-ended question, right, and this is actually, sorry, this is an important part too, which is participants could be able to answer both before and after the program and it would help provide evaluation data. So what this means is you can't have two different questions. Your open-ended question should be the same single question. And think about your X's and O's framework. You ask the same single question every time that you have an O, because the data that you get back, you should be able to compare over time, right? So, sometimes a lot of times people will ask a question like, since you've participated in the program, tell me, have you seen a change in blah, 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 right? You can't ask questions like that because the same question should be able to be asked in a pretest, and you can't say because of the program, because that means nothing to anybody in the program, right? That hasn't started the program yet, right? So in this question here, right, please explain your typical exercise routine over the course of an average week. If you do not typically exercise, please write do not exercise regularly, right? If I have a nutrition program, I can ask that same question of somebody who's never been to my program. I can ask it to someone who just started my program. I can ask it to them at the end of my program on the last day of graduation. And I can ask them 6 months later. And I might get a different response every time, but I should be able to compare those responses and see what's happening to, right, their opinion about their exercise routine over that time and compare it because it's the same question, right? Closed-ended question example: how many times have you consumed fast food? For example, McDonald's, Taco Bell, and Burger, etc. during the last 10 days. I have not consumed any at all. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 or more times, right? If they start my program on the first day or they haven't started, it's day 0 and they're at a 5, and at day 30 they might be at a 3, and at day 90 they might be at a 1, right? Again, it's a closed-ended question, but I can compare numerically what I expect to see from them as a result of the change, right? So another example here: how many times during the last 10 days have you exercised for 30 minutes? Obviously, in this case, right, higher number is worse, lower number is better. Right, it doesn't really matter which way you go as long as that you have a scale that works. I don't have exits here, so that's obviously a failure on my part, right? But that's something worth noting. The second question, right? So you need 2 questions, one open-ended, one closed-ended. The second part is this, which is, right, in analyzing the data collected, what themes would you expect before for open-ended questions, and what themes would you expect after, right? So the idea here is, right, the same way I basically said, I'd expect them to say they don't exercise whatsoever when they start the program, and I'd say that they exercise, a couple times a week in the middle, right? And then 30 days or more into our program, I expect that they say they exercise, 5 days a week or 30 minutes at a time or more, something like that, right? Just really basic, right? If you thought your program was working, what would you expect to see the answers look like over time, right? The second one, quantitatively, right, based off the numbers you chose, right, 5 being worse, meaning more fast food being eaten, I'd expect higher numbers early on or at the start of the program, and as they get healthier, they should eat less fast food. I'd expect these numbers to go down, right? Just so I can see that you have an idea of what you should be looking for in the analysis of that question once you get the information back. So that's all I'm looking for is, right, one open-ended question that should be the same one question you can ask at pre-test and post-test. One quantitative closed-ended question available to be asked at pre-test and post-test. And then a very brief 1 or 2 sentence summary of what would you expect the responses to look like and how would you expect them to change from pre-test to post-test once you got the information back. Questions about that specifically? All right, let me pull this up here just so you can see. So if you're familiar at all with surveys, you might be familiar with Qualtrics. Obviously, I've talked about this before. Qualtrics is one of, there's a few: SurveyMonkey, SurveyGizmo. Qualtrics is another that is kind of a leading manufacturer of survey creation and deployment software. So what you'll see here is that this is, right, this is what would look like when you log in, right? So this is my work instance here, right? And you can see a number of different surveys that we've created, right? And each of these is a different a survey that's being made. You can see how many questions I have, how many responses we've got back from it, right? You can see the trend in terms of how many times, how much people are responding over a certain period of time. So each of these is a different project. I'll show you one example. So we did a leadership retreat amongst all of our executive and management staff, right? And so what you'll see is, I'll let you preview the question. You get your little mobile view here, right? And you get your web view. So what you can see is questions like, please rate your overall level of satisfaction, right? You get to ask your questions. So these are closed-ended questions. Right? There's your exit. I don't know. I have no opinion. Very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, etc. Right? What did you find most valuable about attending? Right? Open-ended question. They can answer whatever they want here. What changes can we make to improve the next one? So again, you see these are both very action-oriented. Right? What did you like about it? Because I want to do it again. Right? What changes can we make next time? I want to do something to improve it. Right? Here we have a list of, right, please rate your satisfaction, all the different things that were part. So we took the agenda and we broke it down into different subparts, right? So you can say, well, the food sucked, right? The networking was great, right? The introduction was super boring, right? This icebreaker exercise was dumb, right? But I did really like the location. The length was too long, right? But the day worked for me, right? Or I'm neutral on the day. I didn't really care. Right, so you can see both here on the website, what this would look like for a mobile user, right? You can see on it here, right? But this gives you an idea of what it looks like once you create it. If you were to go back and actually submit this, right, you'd get some data in here, and so you can go and do this reports function. So Qualtrics is great because, right, you get the analysis built in right here for you. So what you'll see is, please rate your overall satisfaction, right? We can quickly see, right, 17 people, right? Here's the number. How many were satisfied, very satisfied? So if we come down here, right, the average was 4.48 out of 5, which is, basically a 3, a 4, and a 5. So somewhere between somewhat satisfied and very satisfied, right? That's pretty much all we need to know, is that overall people liked the event. Right? We might want to see what this person's responses were because they're the only one that really didn't like it. Let's find out why they didn't like it. Right? Down here, right, you see the percent. So over 50% were very satisfied with the event. That might be all we want to report. Right? We could easily definitely say 88% of people were satisfied with it. That might be enough for most people. To me, I'm very much a person who says, this is nice to hear. This is not information that we can really use, because if everyone just says it was great, we don't learn anything. I might be the type of person who's going to go read these 3 people's responses to see what they say, because we can look for something we can take action on to try to make it so that we're 100% here next time, right? Or at least move these 3 people into this category. Right? What did you find most useful? Right? This is, qualitative open-ended information, so we can see everybody's individual responses. We can also export this whole report as a PDF, right? So you can see the same question here, right? And then what you'll get is, right, here's everybody's qualitative feedback from that question. So we can read it all, see what they liked. We can see, right, if we were going to make any changes, right? A lot of people said no. Some people said cut it to 2.5 hours because it was like 5 hours and that was way too long, right? This person says a full day would have been better, so we get mixed opinions, right? Some people said perhaps some cookies at the last hour, got real boring and I had a hard time paying attention, right? So we could take in some of this information, do something to change it for next time, right? Rate your level of satisfaction. So we asked, right, about 10 different things. Each one of those things, right, has a color. So here's all the stuff we asked about here, right? This doesn't do much in terms of helping you identify which color is which. You can obviously use the key here, right? But what you can see is, right, a little less, a little bit more, a little more neutral, a lot more somewhat satisfied, and a whole lot of people in the very satisfied group for all categories, which is what we want to see. Right here, again, you can see, right, for each of the categories, what the average response was, right? How many people answered each of them, the minimum score, the maximum score, the standard deviation, things like that, right? If you want to see it broken down by responses, you can then see, right, no, the food, food, somebody was dissatisfied with the food, someone was dissatisfied, right? 68%, 72% were very satisfied with, the introduction and program intent portion, right? So you can see all of your information, right? And then again, some qualitative feedback. So, tools that you can use like Qualtrics and others, right? I don't have to be a statistician. I mean, I am, but I don't have to be able to run this report. When my director said I'd like to get feedback from the event, all I did was I exported this document and I sent it to them and I said, here you go. Please read. And they went, oh, this is perfect. Thanks. Right. So it saved me the hassle of having to go to Microsoft Excel, right, create a bunch of tables, write up what the tables mean and send it to them, right? Because I basically put a big, red box around this. I said, this is very good. I said, this is very good. Please read the following. And that's all I really had to do to communicate. So, right, there's the way of optimizing technology to make it better for you. Right. If you go back to, I'll give you just kind of a quick and easy, right, the website feedback one, right? So this is the simple question, 3 questions we asked, right? Tell us whether you disagree or agree with the following statements below. Right? I could find what I'm looking for. Your website was helpful. It's visually appealing, etc. Right? We can get their feedback. 2 basic questions. Right? What did you come looking to find? Right? What can we do to improve the quality of our website? Right? And you're done. Right? So I get some feedback from that. Once you're back in here, we'll create like a test project. Right. This is what it looks like when you're actually making a survey from scratch. All right, so you can choose. So this is a multiple choice, and I can say, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Right, the program was useful in helping me learn to eat better. Right. Qualtrics is smart, so it automates and says, oh, wait, no, I know. Is this the type of question you want? Right. No, it's not. So I want to say strongly disagree. Right. Look, it changed it for me. I can say, well, I don't want 5-point scale. I want a 5-point scale instead of a 7-point scale. Right. So it knows that. Right. I say I don't want automatic choices. Right. So I can, if I want 6, I have to say, don't know, no opinion, add my exit. Right. This would be neither disagree nor agree, strongly agree. All right, so there. Now I have a question. If I preview this question, right, do you agree to disagree with the following statement? Right, helping me learn to eat better. Right. This is, again, this is a bad question because I put that the program's in there. So you might want something like this. I try to eat a healthy serving of fruits and vegetables every day. Right. So now this is more of a neutral question. I can ask this at pre-test and post-test, doesn't really matter, right? But I can get people to respond, right? So, if you're familiar with these at all, this is obviously a crash course, but you can pick multiple answer. Now they can select multiple, single answer. You hit this plus sign and I want to ask a new question, right? So I can do multiple choice, right? I can do a multi-line box. So this is where if I want to do the open-ended question, right? Please describe your daily diet, right? Something like that. They can say, I want that to be the first question. I eat mostly McDonald's and Taco Bell and drink beer. Right? We can only hope that one, would have such a good diet. Right. But now we get, some general information. It's only a 2-question survey, but you could see where, right? Well, what would you expect, what would you expect the information to look like here and here before and after your program kicks in, right? And you can get some information from that. So there's all kinds of stuff in here, right? People can upload files. You can have, these heat map things where, right, you can say, please take a look at, the image below and the colored area. Tell me what you think, right? This hot spot, in the green section, right? We call these like matrices. So you can, you can give these multiple, right? You could do strongly agree, strongly disagree that way. You can ask for a slider, right? So draggable bars, do something like this. So this is an example of, this is my actual dissertation research that you can take a look at, right? What you can see here is a consent page, right? So this gives a bunch of information about the survey itself, the importance, the purpose, what it's going to be used for, right? People have to agree to participate, right? This is the skip logic that I talked about. So if you don't use the library, jump to question 5. I've built in here so that if you say, no, I don't consent to participate, you get kicked to the end of the survey, right? So you don't even have an opportunity to participate. This basically asks people to not use outside internet resources while they're taking the survey, because the survey has to do with how much you know about stuff, and I don't want you cheating. So if you don't say yes that you won't get help, then you get kicked to the end of the survey, right? And then we have what you'll see is, so the idea here is this is helping to measure people's preferences for the federal budget. So if I say, yes, I consent to participate, and yes, I won't get outside help, right? Now, this is a bunch of sliders. Each of these is a different area of spending for the federal budget, right? And so I have to actually, this is asking me to figure out what I actually think the government spends, so I can figure out on my end how much you know about the budget, right? So I think we spend about 35% on health, and about 22% on government, and 6% on this, and 22 on military, right? Or something like that, right? How to check if people are paying attention, right? You'll see stuff like this, which is, we call an attention check. So if you're actually reading instructions, you will have noticed that it says, please set this to 0, right? So if you don't set that all the way to 0, if this is still sitting here at 15 when you submit your data, right, I throw you out because I don't believe that you paid attention, and therefore I don't trust your results. So those are all the types of things that you can do as kind of a good check of making sure people are paying attention, right? Sometimes people will throw in, for question number 5, please choose don't know, or something like that. So if it's multiple choice, that there's a certain answer they have to give or something like that. That way you can see if people are actually paying attention, stuff like that. I just wanted to share a few of those examples so that people can kind of see, right, what the results look like. Obviously, you can take all this data, export it, and you get it into a spreadsheet format. So, if you open it up in Excel, you'll get a whole lot of raw data, which I can give you something like this. So you can take a look once it opens, right? This is actually how my dissertation exports. So obviously, right, the PDF report that you saw was great, right? But this is actually, for each of those sliders, this is one, right? So this is a single person's response, right, to my survey, right? This is what they put for slider 1. This is what they put for slider 2, for slider 3, right? So this is all one person's response, and I can see all the different raw numbers. So when I actually want to go make my own graphs and visualizations, I can pull all of this information for myself, right? And then actually, calculate averages, put my own graphics together, stuff like that. So that's kind of what they'll look like. You can sometimes see, if you have demographic questions, so you'll get something that looks like this. So this is, again, right, obviously all of did they consent? They all said yes. If they agreed not to cheat, they all said yes. Right? If I have demographic questions in here, right, not everybody got these questions asked of them, right? But if they had their ethnicity, what was it, right? If they are married or not, right, you get that information. So, if they work in the government or the nonprofit sector, you see all that there. So that's really gives you kind of an idea of what, the presentation of the results would look like when you're summarizing, right? These different types of tables. This is what you get when you download all that information in a raw data format and start having to deal with, actual zip codes, actual responses, actual, what's your religion here, right? So I can see it. So you can see the raw data, and then from here, right, you make your own pie charts, your own tables, your own graphs, etc. Any questions about any of that? Is there anything anybody would like to see out of Anybody from used Qualtrics before or have any questions about what that type of tool can be used for? All right. If there are no questions about that, then I will go ahead and end the lecture and recording for the evening. I will see you all next week. Don't forget about your discussion board post. And then I will stick around as usual to answer individual questions people have about anything. So have a good evening.